Take a guess. Heads, tails, or something else entirely?
Hugo's finally arrived as our second limited ice attacker. He's taken his sweet time, but being the phantom thief that he is, it seems fitting to show up and make an impression just before Curtain Call, being the final character we'll have before 2.0. Which makes it all the more ironic that our first limited banner in 1.0 was Alan, another limited ice attacker. But despite both fitting the same element and role, they couldn't be more different. Instead of hanging around on field doing constant damage, Hugo's the kind to show up, take the spotlight, then quickly disappear, robbing enemy targets of a ridiculous amount of health. Although the damage numbers you see come from him are pretty high, and the TECHS in his kit very verbose, he's actually quite simple to play, taking up little field time and being straightforward on how he approaches fights. It may even surprise you to hear that it may, in fact, be more optimal to play Hugo with manual chain turned off. Given our last male character was highly technical with specific input, distance and timing requirements, Hugo at first comes across as a breath of fresh air for players that don't want to spend too much time in the lab. But like his fellow Mockingbird protege, the underlying systems that allow Hugo to pull off his eye-watering damage numbers do end up being quite complex. When every frame matters for damage, systems we've known for almost a year get revamped, and team building conventions are turned upside down, it does mean we've got quite a bit to cover. So let's break down Hugo's kit and the intricacies behind his moveset, and go over how he interacts with and breaks the rules of the game. We'll then learn how to best cater to his damage requirements and cover off how both characters and enemies do or don't sync up with his kit. Then we can go through his drive discs, vengeance and stats, and finish up by seeing how Mindscapes and Bangboos influence the way he plays. No need for a showcase at the end this time, as I've already got some uploaded. And if there's one character that drives home the importance of brevity, it's Hugo. So let's hurry up and learn the steps we need to take to dance with the dust. Hugo almost exclusively revolves around the Totalize mechanic. When you land Hugo's EX special or ultimate against an enemy that's in the stun state, the final hit will immediately end their stun state. In exchange, it will refill the stun bar and lead to a large burst of damage, both scaling with the time left in stun. So use Totalize early and you get up to 25 days refund and a bunch of damage. Use it late and you get very little days and similarly little damage. Regardless of how long is left, Totalize has a motion value of 1000%, but between 0 and 5 seconds, you get an extra 280% for every remaining second, more than doubling its damage to 2400%. Between 5 and 15 seconds though, you still get an extra 100% for every second left, capping out at 3400% damage. Which means Totalize, by itself, can hit harder than some attackers' entire ultimates. What's even better is that Totalize is triggered by Hugo's skills, but is distinct from them. At level 12, Hugo's EX special is doing just over 747% damage. So when coupled with the 3400% from Totalize, that's over 4147% in damage. Ultimate hits even harder, doing 3055% damage by itself, meaning you can get 6455% with one skill. And although Totalize is distinct from EX and Ultimate, the game will treat its damage time to be the same as that of the skill that triggered it, which means a 4-piece buffer Electro would buff Ultimate's Totalize, but not EX's. And this is important to keep in mind for the endgame modes, like Shield Defense and Deadly Assault, all of which offer buffs that could influence Totalize's damage. But while the huge numbers seem impressive, it's actually quite low when you think about it. Take Evelyn for example. Depending on the comp and enemy, she can get up to 7 chain attacks in a single stun. Just factoring in the damage multiplier increase on her additional ability and nothing else, that add up to almost 20,000% in motion value of level 12 skills. And while not every attacker is getting those numbers in stun, many can carry their weight in the out of stun period and benefit from enemy mechanics as a result. Hugo though is only getting damage on stun. Heck, even if the Totalize hit puts the enemy in stun, Hugo still won't get it, as the enemy needs to be in the stun state before Totalize connects. This isn't too big a problem, as the hit just before it will trigger the stun state, and Hugo's core passive gives him extra days build up on his EX against out of stun enemies. But other than normal mobs, you rarely, if ever, want to Totalize that early. It's only worth ending the stun faster if you can't do more damage than the gains you'd get from Totalize scaling. Hugo's core passive gives him 12% crit rate and 25% crit damage if his chain attack hits an enemy or he puts an enemy in the stun state. And his chain attack does a fair bit of damage, over 1400% at level 12. It may say slash damage, but this is reflective of the whole attack, including the charge shot. Still, 1400% is very high for a chain, and it's pretty fast too. Even if you use up 2 Hugo chains, his entire combo, with ultimate, takes just about 7 seconds to pull off. Give him the same circumstances as we did Evelyn, and Hugo's now doing almost 9000% in 1 stun. Still a fair bit short of the 20,000%, but because Totalize in stun, that means you can go back to building days immediately. And with the days refund, that means Hugo comps are going to be getting a lot more stuns than any other team in the game so far. His core passive also gives him a huge stat stick for running double stunners, 300 attack for 1 and up to 900 attack for 2. Which means Hugo's teams have the highest days buildup in the whole game. Against Marionettes, Evelyn is usually going to be getting around 3 stuns. Hugo? He gets 9. So ending stuns early is good. Since Hugo is usually running double stunner comps, it's not like their chain attacks are doing particularly good damage for the time they take up. And Hugo's motion values are pretty poor. But there are things you can do. After Hugo performs a chain attack, he can shortcut into a dash attack. Its damage is nearly non-existent, but it still has quite a few uses. It helps with generating some extra energy and decibels for one. So this is handy to do between chains, as you can just immediately swap out and don't really lose any time by doing it. And being mindful of time is a big deal, as it turns out that every millisecond you waste in stun is going to tank your totalized damage. Disorder is an example of a time-sensitive mechanic. Trigger it early and you do lots of damage. Trigger it late and you do very little. This is because it scales directly with the time left on the enemy, measured in seconds. I've covered this briefly in another video, but in summary, because Disorder's damage bonus is measured in seconds, that creates thresholds. Trigger Shock Disorder 105 seconds after the anomaly is inflicted, and you deal 289,738 damage. But if you trigger it after 155 seconds instead, it still deals 289,738 damage. Any trigger within the second will always yield the same damage. Let it tick over to the next second, even by just a few centiseconds, and suddenly the damage takes a big drop. The Burn and Corruption are a little stricter, with 0.5 second thresholds instead, but what's important is that the unit of measurement used for the final damage are seconds. Totalize, though, is fully dynamic. 3 different totalizers, all triggered within 7 centiseconds of one another, will all yield different damage values. That's not too bad, as you aren't suddenly getting big damage losses because you're 1 millisecond too late, but that also means you really can't slack in your in-stun rotations. Even just sitting on the chain prompt for longer means you're using up the in-game time, as it doesn't actually pause the in-game clock, just slows it down. You can trigger a chain before the final hit of Hugo's EX lands, wait in the menu, then get Hugo to chain after the stun has finished from Totalize. That's because time still passes while the chain select menu is up. This isn't just something that affects character actions, but the stun period itself. If we do the same rotation, but in one we mash out of the chain select menu as fast as possible, and on the other we wait until the very end for all the chains, the one that got out of the chain select menu faster gets a full 5 frames of extra stun time, which translates directly to totalized damage. Waiting until the very end to go into Hugo's chain and then totalize is going to be hitting for less than one where you have good timing or mash your way out quickly. Thankfully, although you do want to maximize Hugo's damage, it is not as unforgiving as other characters. Zambi, for one, absolutely needs these 5 extra frames to get her full burst in, but that doesn't mean we don't want to optimize where we can. Use Lighter's Quick Assist to quickly trigger your second chain, and you may be doing 4.6 million damage. Fall back on Lycaon's Charge Basic instead, which is a fair bit slower, and you've dropped to 4.5 million, losing over 40,000 damage, just like that. Even little things start to matter. Ladder's regular special has short range, so it won't hit if you try using it instantly. Which means you need to run up close for it to land, and this does lead to some time loss, which in this example has Hugo hit for 4.56 million. But if you ever so slightly delay your swap to Lighter and make use of Hugo's dash attack after the chain as a gap closer, you can save time, and that alone gives you almost 30,000 damage, increasing it to 4.59 million. If you're familiar with the intricacies of the stun state though, you might be thinking, aren't you going too fast? What about stun recalcs? If you're not familiar with stun recalcs, I've got a video that covers it, but in summary, you know how when you stun an enemy their bar pauses and flashes numbers for a bit, only to decrease after a short while? And the same thing happens when you trigger a chain attack. That's the stun recalc. These pauses are good for us, as they extend the total stun duration. The problem is that the first pause would always take priority over another. If you stun the enemy, their bar would pause. When you trigger a chain attack, it pause again. But if you triggered a chain attack while the first pause hadn't ended, the game would skip the second pause entirely. It could only ever process one pause, so if you tried overlapping them, you'd lose the second. So paradoxically, being fast meant you had less time to work with in stun. You'd think the same applies for Hugo. A ladder that lands his quick assist and triggers chain before the bar has time to decay should do less damage than one that waits just a few frames after the bar begins to decay, as the ladder won't be missing out on a second's worth of stun pause from the Recalc. But as it turns out, instead of seeing 8 points of decay on the stun bar indifference, both of Hugo's freezes land with the exact same amount of decay. In fact, it's the one that didn't respect the stun Recalc and just stunned faster that got the bigger damage number. This makes no sense. We already have clear proof that the second pause shouldn't happen if the first is still ongoing. Except it does make sense, because as it turns out, the Recalc from triggering stun and the Recalc from triggering chains are different. This issue only applies when a chain Recalc overlaps with one from the start of the stun, and not when a chain Recalc overlaps with another chain Recalc. If we trigger a Recalc with Sambi's chain and immediately trigger another, this should mean we lose out on the second pause. Count the time after Astra initiates her chain, and we just about get a second. Now if we do the same thing, but instead wait for the stun bar to decay, we should expect the pause after Astra initiates her chain to be longer than the previous one. Except that the wait is exactly the same. 1 second. And sure enough, both still hit when the gauge decays to 97. It should be observed that this also shows that the pauses don't stack. The pause doesn't get bigger when overlapping them. Which means that for most characters, you still don't want to be triggering chains back to back. Hugo isn't most characters though, because it appears that it's not the actual stun time that is used for his totalized calculations. In practice, the second pause just takes over from the first, but as far as totalize is concerned, these pauses are all being added to the stun timer. If you use Light as special, you're still able to trigger a chain before the first pause expires. Yet for some reason, triggering it with Light as quick assist still yields bigger damage numbers. So the second pause may be eating away at the time from the first when it comes to the actual stun time that the enemy has. But for Totalize, it seems to just consider it to be added onto the stun time that it uses for its calculations. And yes, this does account for chain menu delays. Which is a bit unfortunate, because it just reinforces how important speed is for Hugo. You don't need to have perfect execution on delay and attack so that you're triggering chains on the frame the stun bar begins decaying. But the faster you cancel out of the chain select menu and the faster you trigger chains, the more damage you'll do. Although to be fair, this is definitely a lot nicer. Had stun Recalc with chain pauses worked the same way it did with those from initiating stuns, rather than losing a few tens of thousands on a 4 million plus totalize, you'd be losing a few hundreds of thousands instead. So I much prefer it this way. Stun Recalcs are not the only way of extending stuns though. There's enemy-specific mechanics that can help, like in pairs, which scales with totalize. And character-specific too, like with Lattice Collapse. Unlike in pairs, it's a pause to the stun bar, not an increase to the stun duration. But take it to the lab, and Hugo's totalize does scale with it, making Lighter incredibly important to get the most out of Hugo. Lycaon also helps, as Freeze is another way of pausing the stun bar, and that too scales with totalize. It can be a bit finicky though, as when Freeze happens is important. If you happen to get Freeze after Hugo's first chain, the attack that will trigger the second chain is most likely going to be a finisher, which means it'll force Shatter and end the Freeze prematurely. So instead, timing it so that the Freeze applies just as Hugo goes into his first chain, or have it applied on Hugo's second chain before Totalize, is the ideal option. With how much extra time you can get out of Freeze, this means that it's often worthwhile delaying its application until stun. And thankfully, anomalies only take over if a finisher lands on the active character. So with Lycaon on the team, you could EX and swap out to build days while simultaneously delaying Freeze application. Then bring him back in with another EX or defensive assist just before stun to get his core, additional, and a well-timed freeze to boost Hugo's damage. All of these methods of stun extension are doubly important for Hugo, as in practice, it's impossible to get the full 15-second bonus out of Totalize without them. By default, most boss enemies are stunned for 12 seconds, ways away from the 15-second maximum bonus that Totalize provides. But this can vary. Marionettes, for example, has a base stun duration of 7 seconds. The same is true for most doppelgangers. Other enemies though, like for Bowdy, have a stun duration of 13 seconds. with M1 lighter on for bounty and not doing chains is griefing, since with 5 extra seconds on top of 13 at base, you still have 15 seconds left on the stun time even after doing your chain. Try doing double chains on Marionette without any extensions, and you've pretty much lost all of your Totalize bonuses. So it may not be optimal to always double chain on Hugo. Less time on chains does mean more damage on Totalize, but the motion value on Hugo's chains means using only one would end up being a damage loss. Not to mention less anomaly buildup, which could help with free setups that more than make up for the extra time on chains. But there are ways that could make single chains do more damage than double chains, like letting Totalize benefit not only from the time scaling, but also give it an extra 15% in damage bonus. Stunner chains are slow, and it's not like they do any meaningful damage in stun. Certainly a lot less value from just doing another Hugo chain. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use any stunner chains though. You can swap cancel out of Hugo's EX at any time. This may not seem too useful, as stun is about to end anyways, and you don't want to waste stunner resources on the in-stun period. But if instead of doing a second chain on Hugo, you go straight into an EX, and then trigger a chain before Totalize lands, you can go into a stunner chain. As Totalize ends the stun immediately after, that means you're getting your stunner chains to land in the out of stun period, letting it overflow. Better yet, because the Swing Jazz Drive this set only cares about launching a chain attack and not landing a chain attack, that means Totalize can benefit from its 15% damage bonus. After all, you're activating the chain just before it hits. With this bonus, you're not just being faster than double chains, you may even be doing more overall damage with it. Just keep in mind that this very much rides on your team's stats and Mindscapes. Running Polar Metal or Elemental Damage D5 for example would make its relative increase worse, as between Hugo's own damage percent bonuses, as well as contribution from team members like Lead Isolation, Ice J Teapot, or general buffs on endgame content, damage percent does end up being quite saturated. And there are buffs that can increase chain attack damage, which would make double chains be stronger. But it is faster than double chains. With the extra scaling from triggering Totalize earlier, it's remarkably competitive. And since it means both ending stuns faster and starting off with Daze build, it can help you get more Totalizers in a run, depending on how the fight lines up. Just keep in mind that it only works out of EX specials, as you can't swap out of Hugo during his ultimate. Staying on Hugo after EXs and ultimates isn't all that bad though, and that's because after these skills, Hugo can shortcut into the final hit of his basic attack, Dark Abyss Quartet. As mentioned before, Hugo's kit outside of his chains and Totalize skills does not have good numbers. Nothing shows us off better than the first 3 hits of his basic attack string. Its range is poor and deals physical damage, meaning no anomaly or damage percent bonus gains. But its 4th hit has him twirl his scythe and fire off a shot while doing ice damage. If you tap or hold basic attack after that first twirl and shot, that'll take him into an additional basic attack, Concerto, which also deals ice damage and leads into a second shot. So although the first few hits of Hugo's basics aren't good, these follow-ups are actually pretty decent, especially when charged. The shot portion of both Quartet's Basic 4 and Concerto can be held down. When doing so, the shot upgrades into a charge shot, doing more damage on days, as well as building more energy, decibels, and anomaly. Despite it taking a little longer, it practically doubles all the parameters, meaning you almost always want to do it over regular shots. And most of Hugo's kit shortcuts the Basic 4. You already know that Hugo can do so after EX and ultimates. But he also gets it off dodge counters and quick assists. But dodge counters and quick assists specifically have access to an alternate charge shot. If you tap, you go into Basic 4. If you hold, you go into the alternate shot. They even have their own independent motion values, which scales with the level of the skill that triggered it. But they are still considered basic attack damage, even if their scaling is determined by your dodge or assist skill level. Unfortunately, despite it looking really cool, these alternate shots aren't actually very good. They are stronger than charge shots from Quartet, but since that means Hugo skips the slash portion, it adds up to being worse overall. It's just 6 frames faster, but under 3 times worse in almost all aspects. So although they do look cool, you're better off just going to Quartet instead of the alternate charge shots. Not like you have many opportunities to do so, as Hugo really doesn't want to be on fielding when possible. But it can be very helpful after a double chain EX Totalize or ultimate, letting you build some extra energy and anomaly to better line up freezes for the next stun. Granted, Hugo doesn't actually struggle with having enough energy to fund his EX Totalizers, especially when using ultimates. But when possible, you still want to use Hugo's EX special out of stun. We've already covered how it does get a bit of a daze buildup increase from his additional, which is nice. Better than that though is the fact that it builds a decent amount of anomaly and decibels. It's even more important when you abstract it beyond just Hugo. EX's out of stun can help build that extra morale to fuel Lyda. And depending on your deadly assault buff, you may even need to be using EX specials before your burst too. Raging Storm only increases crit damage of the agent after landing EX specials or aftershocks. That means you need to EX before your stun if you want your chains and automates to benefit from the buff. And the extra energy from charged shots can help. Although, if you're double chaining, you may not even want to go into charged shots. Just initiating basic 4 will lead Hugo to automatically link into the shot, so you can just tap and immediately swap out. Or if you do need some extra build-up, do the full charge shot, but instead swap out after going into Concerto, the second slashing shot. Factoring all of this in, and you may be able to see that there's quite a few ways of coming off stun with Hugo. Maybe after you standard double chain and Totalize, you quickly go into basic 4 and swap out your stunner so as to not lose time. If you're in need of anomaly and energy, you can then commit to charge shots. You could skip the double chain and charge shots and instead do a chain overflow into your stunner for swing jazz and extra days. Or you do none of these, and instead go straight into Lyda to apply collapse right out of stun. Which brings us nicely into Hugo's teams and character interactions. With Hugo's passive incentivizing double stunner comps, that's going to be the shell that makes up most of his best teams. I trust I don't need to bat for Lyda any further. With his Wenjin, he provides the highest buff value out of any character, beating out even Astra. His collapse scales with Totalize, and he has one of the fastest heavies in the game, meaning high Totalize scaling after double chains. But there are some things you may want to know about Lyta if you're looking to get the most out of him in Hugo teams. First, weaknesses and resistances also apply to days. Since Hugo is running into Ice Weak content, that means Lyta won't be doing as much days as he would against a Fire Weak boss. And once Lyta spends all of his morale, he's not particularly useful to have on field. With double stunners though, this isn't much of a problem, as another unit that can supplement Lyta's days application and field time would remedy these issues. And although you want to spend as much morale as possible to get more impact and max out Lyta's buff, there are times where you may want to just apply collapse quickly. For that, you don't really need to spend any morale other than the cost of the finisher, meaning you can swap in while holding basic, release, and get an instant finisher. Another important thing to know is how Lyta's quick assist stack works. I've already covered this in my Hugo, Lycaon, Lyta Marionette kill, but to cover it again briefly, whenever Lyta's bar turns purple, he gets a quick assist stack, which is capped at 1. If you bring him in without spending that stack, like through a quick assist or a defensive assist, you can spend morale but not waste your stack. So if you swap out, then back in again, you still get his quick assist despite the bar not being purple. Just keep in mind you only get these stacks when the bar turns purple, so if you don't spend enough to go under the threshold, you won't get another stack. But since Lyta builds a stack whenever the morale bar turns purple, you could actually loop quick assists over and over. Spend the stack, get just below the threshold, then build it again for another quick assist. Which is, in fact, a very good way of building Astral voice stacks. Now, Lyta may not be able to give them to Hugo, but Trigger can. Even without Lyta, Trigger can single-handedly build 3 stacks of Astral voice by using her react special and double quick assist stack off her finisher shot. If you chain Overflow, it should be fast enough to get 3 stacks of Astral voice, Hormone Punk, and all of Trigger's buffs, which would go a long way at making up for any losses and damage from a double chain. Just be careful if your manual chain is off, as it may sometimes accidentally trigger stun on Hugo. And unfortunately, if you try to both build stacks with her EX and her double quick assist, Hormone Punk will fall off before Totalize can hit if you're using double chains. You can avoid this issue altogether by just building stacks while Hormone Punk is on cooldown. Or just rely on Lyta's quick assist to build a 3rd stack, which coupled with double quick assists from her finishing shot would max out Astral. Just be wary that because Trigger's debuff only lasts 5 seconds, and a double chain combo is around 7, you find that Trigger's buff falls off halfway through the burst if you're using her to activate the 2nd chain. If you're running her with other characters with readily available heavies, like Lycaon, then both starting stuns and double chaining shouldn't be a problem. And even with Lyta, if he's too low on energy for EX and can fall back on his regular special, as both it and Hugo's dash attack would lead to Trigger's aftershocks. There's other ways around it too. If you open with an EX instead of her finishing shot, coordinated support means should be firing even during chains, having the debuff last long enough for Totalize to land. And since you're catching her mid-aftershock, you can try to fall back on Trigger's finishing shot and even refill some purge while you're at it. But against small-bodied enemies, this can be inconsistent, as depending on where she is in her aftershock, it may be too far to get the chain to pop. It's also worth noting that with a 25-second cooldown on the quick assist from finishing shot, it'll drift out of Hormone Punk timings. So balancing it out with EX is going to be needed to maintain full uptime. Although, depending on the fight, boss downtime can help bring it back in sync. Even without such excessive min-maxing, Trigger and Lyta could have been the best team for Hugo. She has good days and anomaly application, has good personal damage, and her buffs aren't saturated, also scaling very well with Hugo's signature. But sadly, Trigger has a glaring anti-synergy with him. A bulk of Trigger's damage, anomaly, and days comes from her harmonizing shot Tartarus. This is when the fire text appears on screen and she goes into a barrage of shots. But these will only activate if the active character lands a heavy attack on the enemy. No heavy attacks means no Tartarus shots. And Hugo's EX special is not counted as a heavy attack. Neither is his ultimate. And since swapping to Hugo activates Hormone Punk, you won't be swapping into him for assist follow-ups. Which means you're entirely reliant on your singular center to sustain all of Trigger's Tartarus calls. And being an Aftershock character, this does force your remaining center to take up most of the field time. This isn't too bad, as if you've watched my Trigger guide, you know that there are some ways to on-field her effectively. And although she just about falls short of being in Hugo's best comp at M0, M1 Trigger with her signature blows everyone not named Lyta out of the water. So she can still be a very strong character to run. Another shock stunner you could run is Qingyi, and in fact she could pair well with Trigger, given how well she can on-field. But surprisingly, she isn't quite as good as Trigger is for Hugo. You think of how she likes being out and about and pumps in stun damage, Hugo would work really well with her, as she covers for his weaknesses and amplifies her strengths. Not to mention that using her charge basic without cage leads to a decently fast heavy attack, meaning she's really handy at triggering Hugo chains. Sadly, it turns out that Hugo teams just stun too fast. Qingyi needs to build up to her enhanced basic attack twice before a stun to apply her damage bonus in full. With Hugo's stun refund and a second stunner pumping days, this means she just doesn't have enough time to do this, especially if other stunners are taking up field time to apply their own buffs and debuffs. This does get better with M1 as she builds gauge faster. Not to say that it can't work at M0. She's a stunner, her damage buffs are huge, and she can cover for Hugo's weaknesses. So she's not a bad pairing, but it will require some bespoke routing to be able to get her bonuses in full. Unlike recent characters though, Hugo doesn't need 2 limited banner units to supplement him. Assuming M0 limited units, I wholeheartedly believe that Lycaon is part of Hugo's best team. Being an ice attribute character, he'll provide good days into ice weak enemies that Hugo will be fighting against. His buffs are surprisingly strong, with both 25% ice red shred and a 35% stun damage multiplier increase, which also happens to be buffs that don't see saturation on Hugo. He has no issue staying on field, and unlike Qingyi, doesn't need the field time to apply his bonuses, making him very flexible. His regular special is one of the fastest heavy attacks in the game, meaning little damage loss on double chains. And if you have too much energy, you can always fall back on his charge basic, which works as well. And on top of all that, his EX provides good anomaly application, making it easier to set up for freeze combos. So a Hugo Lycaon shell can work incredibly well. Lycaon specifically though is a character that needs to be mindful of the difference between finishing attacks and heavy attacks. His charge basic will apply freeze and initiate the stun on enemies before its heavy attack portion connects. And that means you're losing both stun duration for Totalize scaling and breaking out of freeze prematurely. So when triggering stuns, do so with his regular NEX specials, or his defensive assists, to avoid this happening. You want to do so anyway to apply his bonuses. The other stunners can do fine, but it'll be more of a struggle. Kaleta's chain damage buff is really good for Hugo, and she stuns incredibly fast. She can also make do with dodge counters and defensive assists to build a lot of days. But all in all, she is very dependent on EXs for fast stuns and her additional ability's chain damage bonus. And with how often Hugo teams stun, she can sometimes struggle to keep up. But if you have her M2, this isn't as much of a concern, and it helps feed Lyta a lot of morale. Pokra though suffers in the same ways Trigger does, needing heavy attacks to activate her Rending Claw, which Hugo can't provide. But unlike Trigger, her Daze application isn't stellar, and she's entirely dependent on Rending Claw for it. You'd think that she could help with damage via Astral Voice through her EX, not to mention that her M6 does provide some damage increases if you happen to have it. But because she also gets it on assist follow-ups, and you can't swap out of it before the quick assist prompt, doing so would use up Hugo's Hormone Punk stack. So it ends up being better to just give up on Astral Voice and have her quick assist into your other stunner instead. Given she's an A rank, she can be pretty decent if you have no options, but you at the very least want another stunner that can on-field. Ambi is the other A rank alternative, but given she offers 0 buffs to the team, it isn't strong competition, even with a fast time to stun. And without her additional ability, which would be the case for most Hugo comps, she'll be energy stopped and struggle in keeping up the Daze application. Instead of obsessing over Hugo's core passive bonus though, it's okay to lose out on the 600 combat attack from running double stunners if that can be made up elsewhere. Astra can work, With her 1200 combat attack, Hugo's still coming off higher than with double stunners. She enables the Astral Voice Drive Disc set, not to mention she has hefty damage and crit damage buffs. But because you can't perfect assist to her, and even if you could, the days would be terrible, you're forced to stay on a stunner, or else you'll swap to Hugo and use up Hormone Punk. And this means you're losing out on a lot of days from being unable to defensive assist, and that makes her very impractical to play without a strictly on-field stunner unit. There's other issues too. Even though Astra's ultimate provides extra chains, trying to fit more than 2 Hugo chains in a stun means you may start to eat into the 5-second period where Totalize scales hardest. If you try doing 4 Hugo chains in a stun without any form of extension, you won't even have time to land Totalize, leading to a net damage loss. You can look at this from a positive lens though. For once, Astra isn't the best support for the team. Instead, why not run Caesar? She provides 1000 combat attack, and with her additional ability, the 25% damage increase is a nice extra. She only uses up 1 assist point on parries, not to mention her daze application is very high through defensive assists and her low cost EX specials, which could even help her pair well with units like Trigger that depend on them. And if you have her Wenjin, Tusks of Fury, the daze application increase would help your remaining stun unit. Just keep in mind that the daze increase from it doesn't apply to Hugo's refund on Totalizes. And since you lose her buff when swapping out, that means you don't want to chain Overflow or swap out of Hugo before Totalize. Nicole can work too. She has the fastest, readily available heavy attack in the game with her neutral dodge. If at M6, her daze with defensive assists is actually higher than that of most stunners, so even without impact percent D6, she's still building a decent amount. As a support, she can run Astral Voice, and her Death Shred would scale well with Hugo's Wenjin. Unfortunately, even with really fast heavy attacks, her EX isn't anywhere near long enough to sustain double chains on Hugo. Which means you might need to fall back on chain overflows with her, if her ultimate isn't ready for the stun. You could even run Sokaku as an A-rank option. 1000 combat attack, but also 20% ice damage and, at M4 and above, 10% ice res shred too. There's no need to worry about her additional, and since she offers quick assists, you guess it, Astral Voice works too. With chain overflows, you could continue to refresh stacks and keep building them from stun to stun. And with how quickly she can apply Anomaly, this makes her great to set up freezes before stuns. So although Hugo does really want you to be running a Lycaon ladder team, or at the very least a double stunner comp, he can still do okay if you don't have all of the right units. And given one of his best pairings is a standard S-rank character that works out of the gate at M0, it turns out that Hugo's teams can be very low cost. But rather than thinking about what teams you play, it's better to think about what you're playing them into. It's the enemies in the game that dictate the effectiveness of a character. In shield defense, Hugo is actually incredibly strong. His chain attack has very solid range and grouping capability, making quick work of the mob waves. And since his additional ability grants him a refund on his energy when landing EX Totalize, you don't even need to rely on chains and can kill them in no time at all. Since you're almost certainly going to need 2 stuns to kill, this also makes it easier to optimize routes, as you don't need to have multiple chain attacks back to back on the mob wave to build enough decibels. Unfortunately, Hugo's positive encounters end here. You'd think he'd play well into low stun time enemies, like doppelgangers. Because most of the Totalize scaling comes on the first 5 seconds, a single chain into Totalize would still be doing decent damage. Except that then you realize that every single doppelganger is ice resistant. Hugo has some brief invulnerability frames on his charged shots, but they come late and disappear quickly, which means no Demon Lord medals. And for Deadly Assault, half of the Ice Weak bosses are just Miyabi bosses. Bringer and Mage Butcher are both reliant on Attribute Anomaly and Disorder application. And although out-of-stun EXs can help with build-up, you won't be getting them fast enough for their mechanics. If you happen to run Rainbow Element teams like a Hugo Trigger Lighter, then good luck getting enough Anomaly build-up. And outside of the Deadly Assault mechanics, Hugo just falls short against most enemies' movesets. Since Hugo is reliant on stuns to get Totalizes, and his motion values aren't very good outside of it, even with multiple EXs and a Shatter, he often still can't break Bringer's hand summon on time. And his lack of damage outside of stun means he's really not that great against Corruption Complex, as all of the leg breaks have to come from your stunners. Typhon is a boss that practically stuns himself, and you need to wait for his impair to do good damage, which means Hugo isn't going to be stunning any faster than other comps. Even Marionettes isn't a particularly good match. Its default stun duration is 7 seconds, but this can be extended by killing her clones. A Marionette with 5 clones killed has a stun duration of 12 seconds instead, all of which scales with Totalize. Problem is that because Hugo teams stun so fast, there's usually only enough time for Marionette to get 2 clones out, and that's on the good rotations. If luck isn't on your side, she won't spawn any clones, and this can ruin kill runs. So while other teams are getting the full 12-second stun durations, maxed out on thin ice stacks and performance points, Hugo needs to make do without these. Yet even with these issues, it is possible to get kills. And in fact, I did one with a full M0 Hugo like an unlighted team. So although most encounters actively work against him, Hugo still manages to perform well, which goes to show how strong the damage he does actually is. But getting kills is going to ride on your drive discs, vengeance, and stats, so let's go through them. Since Hugo's setup is quite simple, let's start with his team first, as there are multiple ways to outfit them. The one drive disc set you probably always want to run is Protopunk. Historically, this was not a good set, as its buff only lasts for 10 seconds, and it's dependent on perfect assists, meaning it was all but guaranteed to fall off mid-stun. But with Hugo's double chain and Totalize combo ending in 7 seconds, if you open a stun with a defensive assist, you have it for the full burst and then some. And the remaining characters' assets though can vary. If you're running Trigger or a support that can sustain quick assists, then Astral Voice is the obvious option. But since Swing Jazz can be activated before Totalizers with chain overflows, it can also be even stronger than Astral Voice depending on your stats. Given how some fights have tight days requirements though, and Shockstar Disco is pretty strong. It's true that more days is only ever useful if it helps you get an extra stun in a fight. With Hugo getting 9 of them, a little extra days can be the difference between just about getting a Totalize or getting timed out during your chains. And with Shiyu being all about speedrunning, if you've got the damage to kill in 2 stuns, then your limiting factor is how long it takes for you to stun. Although with 2.0 coming along with the new King of the Summit drive disc set, a combination of Protopunk and the new set is likely going to be the best in slot. Hugo, on the other hand, is more than content to use a drive disc set we've had since release, Hormone Punk. And it's the only real option. But for Electro it's ultimate only, and since you end stuns with ultimates, that means no buff to chains. And for most fights, Hugo's only getting ultimates once every 3rd stun, so you aren't getting much damage from it. Polar Meadow only increases basic and dash attack damage, so chain and totalizers get nothing. Shadow Harmony needs dash attacks to match the equipper's attribute, and even Woodpecker's bonus is a problem. With it lasting only 6 seconds, even if you swap to Hugo for a single basic attack before stun, it's not going to last for the full combo. Since Hugo does go into a dash attack after chains and not a basic, that means you don't refresh it then either. You can basic attack after the dash attack, but then part of the damage you're getting from Woodpecker is being sacrificed in lost time. Thankfully, Hormone Punk does kind of line itself up. Just don't bring Hugo in outside of stun or for quick assists just before it, and you'll mostly be okay. There are situations where it can be a problem, as having 2 stunner ultimates will stun too fast. But you can make use of enemy movesets, like Marinette's Invulnerability Phase, to buy yourself some time. It's a hell of a lot easier to manage than on a character like Evelyn, so it really isn't all that bad. As for 2-piece though, that's where Woodpecker shines. Hugo does get 12% crit rate from his core passive, but being at or near 88% crit rate on the stat sheet without running crit rate on your D4 is going to be difficult. And since most of Hugo's damage isn't just one hit, you really don't want that to not crit, so the crit rate from Woodpecker is a big help. If you've got good substat rolls though and don't need Woodpecker, then you can just run a damaging 2-piece set. In that case, it'll just come down to your rolls and which stat is most saturated. Assuming an equal spread, Branch and Blade is the safest bet, but really any 2-piece works. You can run Polar, Astro, Hormone, even Puffer, if running 10% D5. Whichever set has the best substats would likely win out. That may seem weird, given Hugo's Vengeance gives Death Shred, but it really is the case. So before we talk about his stats, let's talk about his Vengeance, Myriad Eclipse. I'll refer you to other creators for the calcs on its improvement over A-rank options, but we're talking more than 30% in damage difference. It gives 45% crit damage and 25% Death Shred, the latter of which gets applied by EX specials, chain attacks, and ultimates. Conveniently, the entirety of Hugo's damage. It's just a stat stick, but a really good one. None of the A-rank options really cover his needs. Gilded Blossom is nice, with attack percent and damage increase to EX specials, but Hugo gets plenty of combat attack percent from his core passive, and he gets damage percent on his additionals. Couple it with Lighter's absurd levels of damage percent bonuses, and it's just excessively saturated. And the damage bonus from the Vengeance won't apply to ultimate totalizers. Marcado Desire is mostly missing out on half of its bonus, as in most fights, you won't be able to have freeze up in time for every totalize. Street Superstar's bonus can be really high, but it only applies to ultimates, so it has the same problems as buff for Electro. And even Cannon Road to surface, as with Gilded Blossom, attack percent is saturated. But since Hugo isn't on fielding, the 6-second 200% attack damage it inflicts isn't going to be coming often. Brimstone is no good either, as it needs basic attacks, dash attacks, or dodge counters. You can get one stack between chains, I suppose, but other than that, it's going to be doing less for Hugo than the A rank options, which leaves only other characters' signatures as filler. Heartstring Nocturne is the best with its high crit damage buff, and since Sentient's Herb Case crit rate bonus applies on stun, it's good too. A Riot Suppressor is another passive option that does okay, but the conditional vengeance struggle a bit. You won't usually have any stacks of Severed Innocence, as dash attacks don't contribute. And Deep Sea Visitor has the same issue, needing basic attacks for its crit rate. It does give a bonus on dash attacks, but only if they deal ice damage, so no benefit for Hugo. You can follow the same approach as with Woodpecker, just to grab that extra stack, so it's not all bad, but it also means lower totalize scaling. All in all, it's just which stat stick has the biggest numbers. So Hugo's signature is by far and away the best option. Otherwise, whatever limited attacker signature you've got will do. If you need A ranks, then Marcato Desire will likely be the best slot, especially if you can manage your freeze as well. But as it's an event engine, you can fall back on Street Superstar instead. Just keep in mind before you choose to roll for Hugo's signature that lighter signature is equally a big deal. It's not just the crit damage it provides, but the impact percent too, as without it, it's not possible for Lighter to max out his damage percent buff, even if you're using all of his morale gauge. So if you do have a Heartstring Nocturne lying about, Lighter's engine may be better. But of course, the same would apply if you happen to have an Ice J Teapot, as that works just fine for Lighter. One of the issues you might have picked up on from these engines is just how saturated Hugo's stats get when running him with signatures in a Lighter and Lycaon team. And the irony is that makes his stat choices incredibly easy. D4 is crit damage, or crit rate if you don't have it on your engine. D5 can be ice damage percent, attack percent, or pen percent, and D6 is attack percent. It's that flexible. Attack percent is massively saturated by his core passive, with the 900 flat attack given freely. Damage percent gets saturated by his additional ability and Lighter's buffs. And even crit damage percent is saturated by Hugo's core passive, his engine, and Lighter's engine. With that much saturation, pen percent would be the best choice, as it is with Evelyn, but because his signature provides Death Shred and pen percent has anti-synergy with it, it also ends up not being great. So genuinely, anything works. Since attack percent is the only thing we can run on D6, that means we don't want to run it on D4 and balance it out with crit damage or crit rate. And for D5, a single substats roll worth of difference is going to be enough to win out. It's that close. Of course, this doesn't apply to every team. Don't run Lighter, damage percent now has a lot more value. Don't use Hugo's signature, pen percent now has a lot more value. Mindscapes changed this too, with M2 providing Death Shred, making pen percent objectively bad. And M6 provides so much damage percent that attack percent D5 becomes best in slot. Talking about Mindscapes, let's cover them. M1 is a stat stick, but a very handy one. With an extra 12% crit rate, you now only need 76% on the stat sheet to max out crit. M2 is when gameplay starts to change. Not only does it give Death Shred to Totalize, but it makes Automates Totalize not in the stun state, so you can get both Automate and EX Totalizers in one stun. As Automate isn't a heavy attack, that means it won't trigger chains, which means you can now do chain overflows on Automates. This does mean longer combos, so you need to be more mindful of bringing Hugo in with Astral Voice in regards to Hormone Punk. And because you're going to be using EX Special every stun, your approach to Hugo as a whole changes. Now you're no longer using EX Specials out of stun, as you just won't have the energy to sustain it. And possibly spending a bit more time on charge shots after rotations to keep up with your energy spend. M4 gives Ice Red Shred after landing charge shots for 12 seconds. And this seems bad, as you're only using charge shots after stun ends, and not before. But if you recall, Hugo's chain attack has a charge shot. So although you'd be missing its game for most of the first chain attack, the second chain and any totalizers should all benefit from it. And M6, it gives a ridiculous 60% damage bonus to all of your totalizers, be it ultimates and EXs. It also gives Hugo's core passive crit rate buff whenever any shots land, which means you can now have it up in the out of stun period. And that now matters, because you get to totalize out of stun too. This doesn't apply to automates and it's only for EXs, but it's a really big deal. That all sounds great, but Hugo's playstyle barely changes. You still won't be playing Hugo out of stun, as M2's energy requirements mean you won't have enough left over to be chucking EX specials freely. Most of your damage still happens predominantly in stun, and given the 60% extra damage you're getting, the numbers get pretty ridiculous. What it does allow you to do is bypass Hugo's main weakness. Can't break bring a hand? No problem, you can totalize it now. Maybe before you had energy spare, but your instant totalize just about didn't kill the boss. Now, you can just totalize without needing to get to the stun again and be done with it. The damages are a lot lower, as it has no instant scaling, dealing only the baseline 1000% motion value. So between the energy requirements and lower damage, on-field Hugo is still not really a thing, even at M6. But it's very much a cheat that can change rotations. Character dupes can get ridiculously expensive though. Thankfully, Bangboo dupes don't cost a penny. Which is good, as Robin is a really nice Bangboo for Hugo teams. I've gone through his benefits on the Marionette kill video, but in summary, he builds pretty decent days, 7 out of 100 on a Shield boss, and his attacks hit pretty hard while also being wide, which can help with some fights, like killing clones on Marionette. With how close some stun thresholds can be in fights, a little extra days can be the difference between 9 and 8 totalizes in a run. Thankfully, Hugo is not that dependent on Bangboos. Unlike Vivian, who benefits massively from Robin's anomaly buildup, Robin isn't going to be contributing much outside of days. Since he doesn't apply ice normally, that means fewer decibels. And with how strong Freeze can be in regards to Hugo's totalized damage, not to mention the 10% crit damage bonus you get from it, it's fine to run other Bangboos too. Shark Boo and Penguin Boo are both really useful, and can even be required for some rotations, like Typhon, the lineup freezes. So although Robin is the best general pick for Hugo teams, other Bangboos can be very competitive, and at times even better than Robin. And with that, you should now know the ins and outs of how Hugo works. His gameplay is actually really simple. Get the stun, use chains, get a totalize, then repeat. But he is a Phantom Thief. The execution of a great heist doesn't take much time. Show up, take the goods, and flee the scene. But the difficulty comes not from the heist itself. Instead, it's all in the preparation that leads up to it. In understanding how fundamental mechanics, like the chain select menu and stun recalcs, impact Hugo's totalize, the various ways of extending and pausing stun durations, and how to integrate both Hugo's mechanics as well as his teammates' skills for the most effective rotations, you can truly learn how to dance with the dust. If you want a showcase of how Hugo performs, I've got a breakdown on my channel that can show you how to put the techniques from this guide into practice. And if you're interested in more detailed character guides, breakdowns of fundamental game mechanics, or just niche tech, then do like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. I've got more videos coming. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.